We'll get started. Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. From the Boston Public Library, I'm Kristen Motti, one of the program's librarians here at the Central Library. We'll be joined momentarily by tonight's featured author, Masha Rumer, and guest moderator, Susan Katz Miller. They will be discussing the new book, Parenting with an Accent: How Immigrants Honor Their Heritage, Navigate Setbacks, and Chart New Paths for Their Children. First, a few reminders and a little bit about this evening's guest speakers. We're in webinar format, which means your microphone is muted and your video is off. While we can't take comments in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, you will see some relevant links sent out to you via the chat box, but we do want to hear from you. So you can type your questions for the author in the Q&A box, also at the bottom of your screen. Subtitles, closed captioning can be turned on or off by the live transcript button, which is also at the bottom of your screen. And a recording of this conversation will be available in a couple of weeks on the Boston Public Library's YouTube channel. Now, to buy your own copy of Parenting with an Accent, please visit our bookstore partner, Trident Booksellers. Information will be put in the chat, and they will ship nationwide with free media mail shipping. Now, a little bit about tonight's featured author. Masha Rumer is an award-winning journalist and freelance writer. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Quartz, the Moscow Times, Parents.com, and elsewhere. An immigrant from the former Soviet Union, she now lives in California with her family, where she is navigating the nuances of multicultural and interfaith parenting. We'll meet Masha in just a minute. Tonight's guest moderator, Susan Katz Miller, is an author of Being Both, Embracing Two Religions in One Interfaith Family, and the Interfaith Family Journal. She is a former Newsweek reporter and former US correspondent for New Scientist. Her writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Christian Science Monitor, and other publications. Now, please join me in welcoming Masha Rumer. Masha, hello.
Hello, good evening. Thanks for having me, and thanks for joining everybody.
Thanks.
I would like to, I'm really excited to be here and to tell you a little bit about my book. In brief, I was born in the former Soviet Union, Russia, and I currently live in California after immigrating, actually today, 29 years ago. So this is my 29th Americaversary in the United States. I wrote the book after realizing a book like that did not exist, but I really wished it did, and it was necessary, definitely for me and many others I knew. I have 2 kids and an American-born husband. We're also of different religions. So this is the book, and I'm so excited to be here and to be moderated and speaking with Susan Katz Miller, whose work I really enjoyed reading. Her book Being Both, hopefully it'll show up on my screen here, and her Interfaith Family Journal, which is a workbook for families who are trying to balance 2 or more faiths or even denominations of the same faith. And I guess I will tell you a little bit more, just a couple more words about the book. So the reason I wrote the book just came out 2 weeks ago, and the reason I wrote it is, like I mentioned, it didn't exist, and I felt a need. When I first had my child, by that time I felt pretty Americanized, right? I was, I was fluent in English. I had steady jobs and so on. I had a relationship and a marriage with an American man, and so. But however, when my child was born, I realized that I kind of went through a culture shock all over again. I had a really rough time. I mean, parents generally don't have the easiest time when they become first-time parents of a baby. But for me, I had this additional layer. I wasn't sure what language to speak to her. Suddenly, I really wanted to speak Russian, even though I spent most of my life living in the United States. I felt sort of isolated from a lot of people in my community because I was just bombarded with all of these memories of my own childhood and upbringing, cartoons, music, um, even some cultural norms, which are a little bit different sometimes from the American ones. I had no idea what kids watch in the United States. And a lot of the parents I met actually were doing the same thing within their own culture, kind of remembering and rehashing the childhoods that they've had, or leaving perhaps the more negative aspects of that behind. So it was basically like a culture shock all over again. It had to do not just with socializing, but also parenting, language. How do we balance two cultures under one roof with my husband, who grew up in a very different way from me? And the more I talked about this with other parents, I realized it's a pretty common situation, no matter where the person is from and no matter how long they've lived here. Maybe they were brought here as a baby. Maybe they came as young adults. Maybe they're in a relationship with a partner who comes from the same culture, maybe not. But a lot of these questions were coming up all over again. And there were two things that I found were very salient, and all of those people, for the most part, had in common. One, this desire to carry on some aspect of their traditions. And that was a very painful experience sometimes to realize those traditions may be slipping away along with language, and they wanted to preserve at least some of that aspect. Two, wanting to give their children a happy childhood, just like any parent, but also help them adapt to the American culture and feel American, whatever that means, but at the same time, carry on a little bit of their heritage as well. So kind of balance both cultures. Then for different people, that might have a different proportion. And I should say also, third, it brought up a lot of trauma. And the book does delve into some trauma as well. People thought about their own losses, their own families, their own ties. For some, their country and their home doesn't exist because of socio-political conflicts or wars and so on. And so I realized this was the perfect time to try to write a book like this. I started publishing articles, then turned this into this project. So I'm really excited to tell you about it today. And I would like to invite Susan to join me. Susan, I'm so excited that you're moderating. You're a fellow Beacon Press author, but I've also really enjoyed how you described a very complex experience of balancing multiple religious traditions. There are a few things that were so salient that stood out for me. We all have the hunger for community, for belonging, and that's universal, which is what you wrote in your book. And the other thing that I thought was very much parallel with the questions I've been grappling with is in your book, you wrote, whether Jews or Christians or Hindus or Buddhists, no two individuals have identical beliefs and practices. So even though we may think of oneself as this representative of this one thing or faith or culture, we're all unique, and we all at the same time have this desire to belong. And now it just comes down to figuring out how to do it. So Susan, thank you so much for joining today.
Hi, Masha. I'm so glad to be here. You know, I love to support a fellow Beacon Press author, but also my book is about interfaith families, but there's a lot of intersecting territory here because a lot of interfaith families are also intercultural, interracial, or even bilingual. So I was really drawn to this book, and I loved the way that you wove together memoir and humor and journalism and research. I think you brought some pictures along, and I wanted to see if you would give that little slideshow just to start us off here in the Q&A. Will you talk about some of those pictures you brought along?
Of course.
Look at this one.
This is a flashcard. It may seem just like a flashcard with funny writing. It's a word, it's a red car. It says mashina underneath, which means car in Russian. It sort of demonstrates my commitment and also a bit of a failure to try to get my children interested in my native language, which is Russian. As the book describes, and maybe I'll touch on a little bit today, it's not so easy that you just like speak to your kid at home in your native language and then they end up like writing poetry in it and being completely fluent. It's often a struggle. So as you can see here, I gave to my young toddler cards. I got them via some special shipping from another country, I think it was from Russia. And instead of trying to learn this with me, they were like, nope, not doing it. Scrawled all over it, tossed it away. So it's been a process, and I'm happy to share some of the learnings with you. That's me. This is the reason I brought this picture, is to show perhaps how slightly different the upbringing was. I mean, a picture doesn't really show a lot, but this is me as a first grader, first day of school as a Soviet school child. We all had uniforms. We all looked identical. A few months from now, I got a little star with Lenin's picture as a child. We were supposed to wear that, which is kind of like the Scouts, but the Soviet version. And then the following year, we became pioneers, which is also similar to the Scouts, but the Soviet version, where we got a different type of pin and a red scarf to wear around our necks. Not something my children are doing this time, of course. And this is a picture of St. Petersburg, my home city where I was born and lived for 13 years. Just wanted to show you the beautiful architecture and the river. These are pictures I took when I came back in 2004. And these are just two ladies selling flowers and berries right in the middle of the city. You can find that in pretty much any city in Russia, but also villages and smaller towns. So that's that. So the culture still prevails back in Russia, even though I'm not there.
So can you tell us briefly a little bit more about your own journey as an immigrant and how you ended up in the United States? And, you know, you talk about the trauma. There is some trauma there often in these stories.
Of course. So I moved to the United States with my family when I was 13. It was actually a little bit easier for me because so for many years, Jews in the former Soviet Union, which includes Russia, were not allowed to leave. And there were a lot of movements, a lot of American organizations supported them, so-called refuseniks. At some point they were able to leave, but they had to spend like months living in refugee camps, for example, in Austria and Italy. This was not my experience. I was fortunate to fly with a layover in Alaska, where I saw water that turned on by itself and like a $5 burger. And we were terrified because this was a monthly salary for an average Russian worker. So we arrived to the United States when I was 13 as refugees, settled in the Bay Area. Obviously, it was a tough transition. So we came right around this time. For the winter holidays, we celebrated secular Christmas, which is called New Year. I got a small set of markers, and that was all my family could afford. So we obviously had a rough time adjusting, language problems, no employment, trying to find employment. My parents were learning new skills, trying to learn English at the same time, and just struggling to make ends meet. But eventually we've adapted. And here I am. But I think it's a very common story for many immigrants. And of course, many people have gone through way more significant and traumatic events than I have, but I feel very lucky.
And then, when you had children, you faced this struggle about passing on heritage, passing on language, and you didn't see books that were really about that experience. And this is what inspired you?
That's right. So I think I brought up a couple of the examples. Food, for example, I was like, well, if I give my children some kind of like a boiled beet at the playground, like a young toddler or older baby, I'm going to get looks, which I did sometimes, and definitely from the daycare provider. But at the same time, I would get questions from my own family, like, what kind of a bottled puree are you feeding them? Aren't you supposed to make homemade foods for them, or feed them a lot of buckwheat, which I actually do. And that was just one of the experiences. Is it okay to rub vodka on their gums if they're teething? Is it okay to let people see the baby when they're just born for the first few weeks, or is somebody gonna is there going to be like an evil eye in Russia? You're not supposed to show newborns, for example. So that was very challenging. And the concept of motherhood is very different in many cultures, including in my own. Women worked, and took care by themselves of the household, of the children, or of the household that subsidized daycare in the former Soviet Union. So there was also the question of, when do I go back to work? How do we support ourselves if I don't? Obviously, that's also a very common struggle. But I felt a little bit out of place with all American mom groups. Things would be perfectly cordial, but I felt like some kind of a connection was missing, and I felt like an outsider. But the books that I mentioned, there were a lot of really good books about raising your child bilingual, but a lot of them seemed more like a guidebooks. I would say, do this, then you get that outcome. And I always felt so guilty, especially when I sent my daughter to an American daycare and went back to work, and she stopped wanting to speak Russian to me at all. Like she refused to do that. And that was very challenging for me. It was such a painful experience. Suddenly I felt that even though I left most of my family behind, my memories were slipping away from me, not memories, but the remembrances of what I really valued and cherished about my culture, my connection to my relatives. And language is such a personal, intimate way of how we identify ourselves. Accents as well, they signal where we're from. And it's a very important part of who we are. And I did not find any writing on the actual immigrant parenting experience. Like, oh, isn't this a weird thing that my kid did? Or, haha, another immigrant parent might understand. And that's something that I realized was definitely lacking, and I decided to write it. And one last thing I'll mention is guilt, parenting guilt. I think many of us who are parents will know what parenting guilt is like, right? But there was this guilt about, well, if I work 11 hours a day, or with my commute, say like 12, right? How do I find time to speak to my child in my native language? And all these books say you must speak to them in the native language or they will not learn at all. And then sometimes it's very common to feel, well, maybe I should just not try. Maybe I should just throw in the towel. Or how do I do this if my partner does not speak my language? Are they going to be pissed off at me if I don't do that? So I tried to figure all of that out, and the research really helped me get some answers of my own too.
One of the things I found really impressive was that you interviewed parents from Latin America, Asia, Africa, Europe, literally from all over the country, who are here, and a huge diversity of immigrant parenting experiences. And you make the point that everybody has different experiences, but there are also recurring themes, like this struggle that you're describing to stay connected to the heritage culture. Can you tell a couple of the stories that you gathered from others that maybe affirm some of those common themes about, struggling with it, and how different families sort of approached it in different ways, or what they found?
Sure. That is such a great question. And I know, Susan, in your process for being both, you also interweave personal narrative and conversations with experts like the clergy and families. And I thought that was that was so beautifully done in your book. And so, yes, in my experience, I spoke to more than 60 individuals. Some of them were experts, but the majority were parents, and they represented like 14 different states in the United States. There were so many compelling stories that I found all just either very educational, but I felt like I could really sympathize and empathize with all of them. And I think a lot of readers will as well. For example, a mom who was a refugee from Iraq, but she was Chaldean. So she was not Muslim, she was of a religious minority. So there's also this question of being a minority of a minority religion in a country of a different majority religion. So they immigrated here, and she remembered how hard it was when her family spoke to her in Arabic and in Chaldean in public. She remembers her mom being reprimanded. Some woman at the store would confront her, like, why are you not speaking English? It's America, speak English now, kind of reminds you, right, of sometimes things that are coming up in the news still today. And so there was that experience, but she was not allowed to speak English in the house at all. Her father said, if you want to learn English, you're going to only speak our home languages with us. I want no English in the house. And so she became fluent. She grew up fluent with all of those languages. But interestingly, when the time came for her own daughters to go to preschool, she had actually a choice. Her grandparents were really happy to watch them during the day. And she was like, yeah, that's great. I will let my parents watch my children and teach them how to be fluent, right? Because to gain fluency in another language, you need to be exposed to it. And especially if it's a native speaker, that's even better. But she decided not to do that. She says that she told me she is a feminist, and some of the cultural practices in her community really just rubbed her the wrong way. And she realized that if she left her daughters with the grandparents, there would be some of those lessons that she did not want them to be exposed to, especially about the roles of women. And so she sent them to the Montessori daycare and preschool nearby, all American. So her girls grew up with her values, but their language skills leave much to be desired, according to her. And of course, she's happy they have the values that she wanted to impart to them, but she really wishes that they could speak Arabic and Chaldean. So there's no perfect solution. That's just one of the examples.
Right. I have to say, I learned so much from this book. For instance, my own great-grandfather, who was a rabbi, when he immigrated to this country in the 1800s, I knew that he was a German teacher in a public elementary school. And I always thought, that's weird. Why did they have a German teacher in a public elementary school? And your book actually helped me to understand that. So could you give a little kind of a recap of how the United States went from actually being very multilingual in that era, and then how and why it has shifted to becoming sort of monolingual, at least in the way it tries to present itself?
That is a great question. And I was so impressed, by the way, when I read that he was a rabbi in New Orleans, I think, right?
Yeah.
That's really cool. So yes, I mean, America was multilingual. There was, and I will qualify that statement in just a moment, of course. But we had, since the colonial times, people brought their languages with them. Of course, like in 1790, that first census, the majority of speakers spoke English. They were, from Scotland, from the British Isles. But there were so many other language groups coming in, right? There was like French, eventually there was Polish, there was Italian, Spanish, all kinds of languages. I guess Italian a little bit later, the majority. There was German, lots of German, like with your ancestors. And some of them were in parochial religious schools, but a lot of times, a lot of these languages were taught in public schools as well, especially if the parents vied for the language to be taught to serve the population. There were many newspapers published in other languages, like, for example, in German. That was very common. Of course, the qualification of that statement is the way the African people who were enslaved were treated, and the Native Americans, because there was, the Native Americans were forced to give up their indigenous languages and to convert. Obviously, the enslaved individuals as well were forced to learn English and to not allowed to speak, not allowed to sing in that language. So that's a very traumatic part of the American history. But when it comes to immigrant languages, they were valued. Again, it's also not like it all changed. It was also a very complicated relationship. If I may actually read a quote about that. There was always, the book makes an argument that there was always a mistrust of immigrants and of differences, because we were always thought of as, even now, right? We're competing for jobs. We're willing to work for lower wages. Sometimes if people are in a union, right, and then there's somebody who comes in to who's not a part of that union, but is willing to work for lower wages, and people who are, who trained for that particular vocation for a very long time, they, might not feel particularly good about that, right? Or language. Why is this person speaking a different language? Why is the person looking different? Why is their faith different? So there's this mistrust of difference that's always been there. In fact, actually, I want to read to you a quick quote from Benjamin Franklin. Well, he basically said there were a lot of German artisans immigrating in the 18th century to the United States, to the East Coast, particularly around the Pennsylvania area. And he said, they're refusing to convert. They're refusing to take on our traditions, and why should they take over our way of life and speak their languages? And they're sending their worst to us. So that's obviously not actually. A second, let me just find that exact quote for you. I have all of my notes. Yes, he said, why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them? And they will never adopt our language and customs. That was in 1753. So even though America was always hailed as this, give me a pour, you're tired, you're hungry, there was still mistrust. And that changed more dramatically as more and more people started immigrating to the United States. There was this federal immigration station opened at Ellis Island in 1892, and it's thought that like 40% of American ancestry is tied to that immigration station at Ellis Island. But then so there were a lot more immigrants coming in, and especially from Eastern and Southern Europe. And then there was World War I raging. Anyway, so enough of that historical context. Basically, there was a really huge backlash of nativism happening at the time. A lot of people who were native born, they were like, what the heck is happening? Why are there so many immigrants? They're taking our jobs. Again, language, they look different, they speak a different language. Then we had the Chinese Exclusion Act passed, right? So Chinese people were banned from coming to the United States. And those who were already here were not allowed to even naturalize. And during the war, like sauerkraut consumption plunged, and there was even a push to call it Liberty cabbage. And unfortunately, the schools closed that were like the language education closed in the United States across those public schools and private schools. They were vilified as dangerous and un-American. The Ford plan, for example, was even they were like having mandatory language classes, English and the way of life. Like you're not hyphenated, you have to be only American. If you're hyphenated, if you do not want to become American, go back to your country. That was 100 years ago. So it's not new what we're seeing sometimes today.
But meanwhile, when we look globally, most people around the world speak more than one language. I know this. We lived in West Africa for 3 years, where people speak a minimum of 2 languages and probably 3 or 4. And so this idea that people should only speak one language is, a very particular and toxic belief that impacts every wave of immigration that comes here, that there's this pressure to lose your heritage language. And so, I don't know, talk a little bit about the effect that has on people, this expectation of monolingualism.
Oh, it's a really interesting concept, because you look also depending on where you live, and if you are, for example, in the DC area or in the Boston area, where the library is, and maybe a lot of the attendees are, it's a pretty diverse area. Like it's been an immigration hub for centuries, I would say, right? But there is no official language in the United States, even though it seems surprising. But a lot of people tried, like there was legislation, people tried to pass legislation to make that the official language, but there is no official language. At the same time, though, it's still the world, like you said, is mostly, the majority of the world is bilingual or multilingual, but we are not. And there is this mistrust of languages. It's kind of a tricky it's a tricky relationship, because on the one hand we say, oh, it's really great to have, but to learn other languages, it's a way to connect with the world, it gives you maybe a head up in the economy, in the global economy. That may be true, but there's not always the same regard for the speakers of that language, right? There was a Pew Research survey conducted that, like, I forgot the exact number. I think it's like 1/4 of people are bothered by when they hear a foreign language spoken in public. Again, I qualify that statement. I think some of them might be immigrants who are bothered by hearing certain other groups of immigrants. So there is that mistrust happening. And that also came with that backlash, with that nativist backlash that I mentioned after the World War I. I mean, it became so bad that like immigration was practically stopped. I guess legal immigration, at least in the 1920s, and English became the majority language, and a lot of people, so to speak, assimilated and didn't speak their languages or celebrate them as much. Like in 1970, for example, like 4.7, like 7.4% or so of people were immigrants, and now it's about 13.8%. So we have the greatest number of immigrants ever in the United States right now.
Mm.
And also one last thing is that bilingualism was thought of for a long time as like a mental handicap. Like if you were teaching a child a different language, or if you spoke a different language at home, they would be mentally not on the same plane as everybody else, which is completely false. It's totally false, and numerous studies have shown that since the 60s. But for decades, that was the common belief.
So yeah, you interviewed a lot of scientists, counselors, educators, in particular about speech and language acquisition for bilingual children. Tell us a couple of the myths that you discovered, or ideas that were debunked by talking with those experts, because I found some of it very interesting.
Great. Yes, interestingly, there's still many myths, and a lot of parents, even parents I know, subscribe to them. And this is not something that just parents of immigrant children are affected by. I think language affects us all, whether we are from an immigrant family or we're grappling with these questions. Even if we're like grandchildren, right? We all remember certain words, perhaps, or certain traditions of our ancestors that are here, and they're valuable to us and very precious, as of course it should be. One myth is that children get confused if they hear more language than one, or they get speech or language delayed if they hear more languages than one when they're babies and toddlers. And that is absolutely not true. I spoke to multiple experts, for example, Professor Erica Levy, who teaches at Columbia University's Teachers College. She actually went on live television, today's show, to dispel that myth that no, children do not get confused if they hear another language. In fact, our brains are wired as humans to hear all of the sounds of the world's languages when we're born, like something like 800 of sounds or phonemes or so. So we're like, our brain is like attuned to all of these possibilities of the languages around us. But as our brain matures a little bit, like towards the end, the second half of the first year of a baby's life, the baby starts to tune into the sounds that we hear, so that they can explore and bond and learn that language, and stops to kind of absorb and and discriminate between the other sounds. So for example, like in Japanese, like lice, like the R and L sounds, that might be hard to pick up, or certain French sounds, or for my people from my homeland, Russians, like the thank you, like the sound that's just impossible for a lot of us. So that's because, but until then, we're able to pick up all of those sounds without confusion. And in fact, bilingualism has so many benefits. I spoke to Ellen Bialystok also, who works at York University, does her research, and she was the one who pioneered all of these great conclusions that, one, if kids are bilingual, they reap huge cognitive advantages because of that. They have better focusing skills, better multitasking skills, because both of the languages are active at the same time. And so the brain basically has to like suppress one when they're using the other and switch really quickly back and forth. And it's not only good for babies and kids, but it's also really good for older adults, because bilingualism and that agility of the brain can stave off the onset of dementia, such as Alzheimer's disease. And that's obviously very crucial, because it's a terrible, it's a terrible illness affecting millions of Americans and people across the world. So there are benefits to bilingualism. And there's another study, for example, from University of Chicago, shows, and others, that being bilingual makes us more empathetic. Not even like if we're totally fluent in another language, but even if we're in a multilingual environment. There were kids who were asked to move certain objects, like little cars, from the researcher's perspective. And kids who are monolingual did not really take the perspective like left or right of the researcher, but people who were just even exposed to another language in their everyday environment were much better able to think, oh, do they mean my left, or like where I am located, or where that other person located?
So being able to see it from more than one point of view. Yeah,
yep, absolutely.
Another idea I found really interesting was that to sort of qualify as bilingual, you don't have to be equally fluent in both languages, and you don't have to be sort of perfect in both languages, because I think that's what people think when they hear bilingual. But the experts you talked to had a much more sort of generous and forgiving definition of what would count as bilingual.
Yes, generous is definitely the word. And I know it's relevant to so many people today, including myself, because sometimes
otherwise you feel that guilt. Oh, my kid is not, fluent enough.
Exactly. And like, not only do we feel guilty about all the other things we're not doing for our children or for ourselves or for, the laundry piles, there's also that guilt of I'm not doing enough. Or if my child is not like reciting, I don't know, like reciting Shakespeare by a certain age, then I have completely failed. Of course, Shakespeare in both, at least 2 languages, and then I've failed. But it's simply not true. The definition, a lot of people historically have disagreed on what bilingualism means. And for a long time, like up until the 60s or 70s, the idea was that they have to have like perfect knowledge of grammar, no accent in any language. They can write, read, speak and understand. And I would also add personally swear in all of those languages. But it's not true. Now the definition, which I like and which is commonly accepted, is kind of like the situational knowledge and the ability to communicate with people based on where you are, based on your need. There is a book, a researcher, a world-renowned researcher, Francois Grosjean, that I really admire, and his definition is using bilingual as somebody who's using 2 or more languages on a daily basis. And I think that's way more forgiving, because the opposite is it's kind of bad. Like, well, if I don't speak it perfectly, or if I have an accent, I may as well give up, or people will make fun of my accent, or I might be searching for words I'm not fluent enough. And that's just, language is living and breathing, and perfect knowledge, and in fact, is not necessary. And in fact, accents are perfectly normal. And in fact, having no accents in both languages is not normal. It's the exception.
Wow. Okay, we're going to go to some questions in a minute, but I wanted to ask one more. You brought up laundry piles, and earlier you also brought up the Russian idea of, women working and doing childcare. And I have to apologize because I know people don't ask male authors this question, and I'm going to ask it anyway, because you wrote a parenting book, but you wrote a parenting book while working a full-time job and having 2 small children. And you describe in the book some of your struggles with searching for childcare, for instance. How did you write this book? Tell us a little bit about what was the time and space you were able to block out to get a book written while doing all these other things?
Okay. Like, how much time do we have left? I think it's a question for just like about anybody, especially during COVID. And that's a really important question. So first of all, the last few months when I was like finishing and writing the book, I had a day job, full-time job, and I left to focus on this book. Unfortunately, I actually did not leave it. I took leave of absence. But then COVID happened pretty much right away. And so this took longer because, again, we were homeschooling, right? And I was writing. So this is more like, how did you manage COVID? Not well. but my husband would be working at home, from a little bedroom office set up during the day. I would have to make sure that the children did not break into the room during his meetings, which sometimes they did. At that time, I was homeschooling and doing this online school and my own activities with them. He would end at about 4 or 5, and then it would be my turn to work on the book. But luckily at that time I was not working. But while on a full-time job, but had contracts and freelancing. But when I was for the vast majority of my preparing the book and writing it, which took 4 years, it was, I did it at night. I learned to multitask very well. So if anybody is thinking of, hiring mothers, a lot of times mothers are discriminated against in the workforce, not fathers. Very relevant question, Susan. But in fact, mothers are excellent at multitasking, as I'm sure most of you know, like switching the brain on and off, focusing on different tasks. Bilingual mothers, I probably would even say.
You have excellent executive functioning skills because you're bilingual. There you go.
That's right. Yeah.
All right, let's go to some questions from our community here. And the first one is from Judy Bolton Fastman, who has her own memoir out this fall.
Congratulations.
Asylum is a great memoir. Here's her question. I was raised by a Cuban immigrant mother, and I feel that so many features of my parents' intercultural relationship have trickled down to my relationship with my husband, even though I'm American born. Have you noticed that others with an immigrant parent have experienced the same thing?
I love this question because, again, this was also a huge surprise. Absolutely. I mean, again, there is such a vastness of immigrant experiences. I'll just preface that. And I do not claim to speak to all of them at all. This is my experience and the experiences of those I've spoken to and the experts that I've spoken to or read the work of or both. But yes, it's actually a very common phenomenon. Nancy Foner, a well-known sociologist, actually writes about this in her work. She writes that, children who used to like look down or criticize their parents' approaches, particularly immigrant ones, become parents, and then suddenly they're like, oh my God, that's actually really cool. I really want to do this. And sometimes it's not even a conscious decision. And this was the case with me too. I mean, there's so many ways. I mean, it's the mentality, it's the values. I thought I was, Americanized as much as, I can be, even though I'm bicultural, I guess. But I was just amazed at how, like, I'm always freaking out that my children are going to get sick if they're not wearing like multiple layers, or how they're hungry all the time. So I'm always trying to feed them. And so those are just a couple of examples. But definitely trickles down even across generations.
So your children will be putting extra sweaters on their children, is what we're saying.
I hope so. I mean, we have multiple pairs of indoor slippers in the house. And sometimes when they forget them, I usually say in Russian, like, how is it that you could lose like your 6th pair of slippers, and remind them, but they're in college. I would be living next door and making sure they wear slippers. That's a joke. I hope they know that. But yes, because the floor is cold. Yeah.
But, scientists have recently been writing a lot, discovering a lot about multi-generational, trauma, how trauma gets passed through the generations. And we certainly, have heard a lot about this for instance, the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, or, enslavement of Africans. But there's also positive things that get passed down through the generations. And you may not even be conscious of, oh, this is something that my grandmother did. And some people grow up with very influential grandparents as well. So you see it going through generations that way.
For sure. Yes, absolutely. And I think it's also, there's that parallel with, religious practices as well, because it's not just about faith and this, or this existential idea of this great deity. It's also, right, the practices, the rituals, the community. So that definitely does get passed on. And I would argue that it's a beautiful thing. It makes us richer. It gives us a better idea of how different people live. It gives us something unique to cherish, and it connects us to our ancestors, whether they're, on this continent or in this country or somewhere else, or maybe they've passed on.
So that leads right into our next question from Maria. She asks, what are both your hopes, expectations, and concerns for your children as adults that they will pass on to their children about their immigration history? What do you hope that they will retain, and what are your concerns about things that will be passed down?
Definitely language is one of them.
That's a hope.
I hope so. I hope, because language is a way to connect to my relatives that live abroad, then some of whom I haven't seen. I haven't for like decades, right? And also I think appreciation of art, certain types of art, that's, or, music, literature, books, not necessarily Russian, but also just world literature. I would say hard work. All parents probably want to do that, but I think the immigrant work ethic is a really big one as well. And respect for the elders is also another big one in my culture, but I know in others even more so, like it's part of the religious practices. So that's definitely something I hope that they inherit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Debbie asks, can you speak to parents' experiences of choosing a parenting style in keeping with their culture and the ways they may get negative feedback from pediatricians, peers, social media, etc.? For instance, co-sleeping, no sleep training, carrying babies all the time, feeding habits, etc. There's a lot of stories about these issues in your book.
Yeah.
But
Well, for sure. I guess there was, for example, a parent from India who her community practices co-sleeping until she was joking, they co-sleep until the child doesn't want to do it anymore, right? And she did. I don't know if she got negative feedback so much, but that's something that she noticed a lot of her peers did not do. Another woman from the Middle East used to swaddle, and she's not a new parent, but at the time swaddling was just becoming like all the rage in the United States, and nobody did that. And they wouldn't buy like swaddle blankets that would have muslin cloths. Another Indian mother had, like, they would use bits of like old saris, for example, to bind the babies, and also just even bind the belly. And also something really interesting is the quarantena concept, which is 40 days, like quarantine. Now we say quarantine, it's like, oh my God, it's COVID. But in many cultures, almost universally, it is considered the norm that the mom stays home with the baby and tries to recuperate after labor, after, pregnancy, and their female relatives or other relatives come and visit and take care of the baby and pamper her so she can be able to nurse, to bond with the child, not have to worry about dishes and like washing bottles and so on. But that's not necessarily the case here, especially with, the parental leave policies in the United States, which is a whole other book in itself, right? And oftentimes there's also this kind of the nesting and cocooning. There was a parent who was talking about, like, the parents were like, oh, we're going to come and bring you lots of food and you're going to have to eat it to make the milk more thick and sweeter. And like the cousins are going to come, the uncles are going to come. And that's normal. And she was like, oh, I kind of want to cocoon, or I'm freaked out about you guys' germs, the immunizations. And she had to make the choice, and she felt her parents, some of her relatives felt a little bit offended, but she made the choice to not do that necessarily. The same with another family I spoke to. Was a Mexican-American family. The husband was from Mexico City. The wife was born in Utah and they live there. There was also that question of the mom coming from Mexico and like always bundling the child in all those clothes, and the hat and blanket so the child doesn't get cold, which I understand as a Russian, right? But she would completely like flip out in those early days, like, oh my God, the American Academy of Pediatrics says you shouldn't do that. The baby can overheat. There's a risk of SIDS and so on. So there's that conflict a lot of times happening. And I guess families just find a way to resolve it and pick and choose. But it's complicated and it is a process.
Yeah. Debbie asks, any stories about women trying to birth in ways consistent with their culture while in an American hospital?
I did not get into, I don't think I got into that in the book. I think it's such an important question, an exploration of, I guess, home birth or natural birth or hospital birth. I mean, there are so many rituals, some ancient rituals associated with that, not just the 40 days postpartum, but also before. I did not get into that, but there were things coming up like on the opposite end of that spectrum. There's how do immigrant communities react to same-sex partners who choose to have a surrogate parent for their baby, or the challenges of adoption, and how do parents who are immigrants who adopt children that are maybe of a different race or ethnic background, how do they pass down their heritage, but at the same time, like dodge possible questions of, oh, is this your baby or is it somebody else's baby? And at the same time, honor their own roots. There was a family I spoke to of two dads, Ukrainian and from El Salvador, who had sometimes they hear things like, oh, that child is not your child, that's not your real child, at family gatherings because it was a surrogate. And the mother was a surrogate mother, and that's incredibly painful. They're like, our parenting experience feels very real to us. So there are those questions, but actual birth, not something that I've looked at in this particular book.
Well, it's interesting because I think culture is sort of thickest around those liminal moments: birth, coming of age, death. Our cultures have ways. They provide ways to us for handling these moments of transition. And so you do find yourself reaching back to them in those moments when you're looking for that support. And that's a way that I think, a lot of what I write about in terms of interreligious families is also relevant in this way, that people reach back to those culture and religion are, interwoven. And so that makes sense. And culture, religion, and language are interwoven. We only have a few minutes left, and Masha is going to do a little reading from the book for a treat as we go out. And I also want to ask one more question myself, because I know that it takes about 2 years between the time you turn in a manuscript and the time that the book comes out. And so I'm looking for an update on your children and sort of how in their most recent year or two, they have evolved in their relationship to the Russian language and to culture, because while you're writing the book, they're very little. So it's hard to tell, how the story's going to go. And of course, the story continues to evolve until they're adults. But how's it going lately with them?
Oh, they're great. Well, obviously there was this effect of, the times we live in, right. And the change there. What has changed is, I think my manuscript stops at like the beginning of COVID, or like kind of halfway point. But since then, they've started actually taking in-person Russian classes, and their Russian has definitely improved. And they've also met other peers. So one aspect, and for anybody interested in the subject or maybe experience it themselves, having others who speak this language makes it seem less weird and less creepy and less like you're like now the weird kid, because kids really want to be like everybody else. But if they don't hear the language or their tradition celebrated, they might not want to embrace them, even if they're really tiny. I was always amazed at how quickly how peer pressure affected the languages they chose to speak, and their for a while refusal to speak Russian back to me. Yeah.
Well, give us a little selection from the book, would you?
Sure. So I'll read from the book, which is from chapter, I believe it's chapter 3. It's about actually chapter 2. It's about finding, and it's the chapter starts focusing on the parenting, and the beginning is about my own immigration story. So this is about naming. Naming our first baby goes without a hitch. I'd known what I'd call my future daughter since I was a teenager. The name Leah was short and lyrical, with a certain gravitas to it. It was also international, not bound to any one culture, leaving its bearer free to choose her own adventure. Things, however, get complicated when the time comes to pick out a name for the second child. After my husband Pete and I find out we're having a boy, we get the obvious duds out of the way. It's pretty standard to not name your baby after an ex-boyfriend or an ex-girlfriend, or after that beach fling in college, even if it technically didn't count, or after literary villains. And if The Simpsons taught us anything, it's to check how the whole kit and caboodle sound together, so you don't end up with a child called Huge Ass or I Need a Bath. More important, I wanted to parcel my son's triple heritage into a perfect first and middle name. My Ashkenazi Jewish tradition says the name must honor a non-living relative. But Pete's family looks to Christian saints and forebears, many of whom harken back to the British Isles. It would also be nice if he could pass in both cultures, kicking it in the sandbox with Americans as Saint Nick, and then eat borscht with his grandmother as Nikolai, all of it conveniently as the same person. We also look to the Old Testament for inspiration. But growing up, the only people I knew with names from the Torah were old or deceased, gazing at me from black and white photographs on the wall. Many Soviet Jews changed their names to conceal their heritage with the rise of anti-Semitism and Joseph Stalin's purges. They feared getting passed over for college acceptance or job promotion, public insults, and violence. And that fear never really went away. The door of our refrigerator is plastered with the picks of the week, and our debates drag on. Hey, can you say Ezekiel between vodka shots? Gym is fine, I guess, but isn't that where people work out? A name isn't a pair of new shoes you can take back to the store if they cut off circulation in your feet. It's not a bad haircut that will grow out. It's a lifelong commitment, a unique identifier, a link to the past, and a harbinger of the future. Oh, no pressure, though. My son arrives into the world nameless. He doesn't have a name the next day either, or the next day after that. We just call him Baby. But nearly a week later, after the annoyed lady from the birth certificate office calls again, we finally settle on a name. But it's not perfect, we soon realize. 2 courthouse visits and several $100s later, Pete and I officially changed his name. Nobody keeps those birth announcements anyway, hopefully.
Lovely. I love that.
Thank you.
In closing, I just want to say during this pandemic, it is so lovely to read books that make us feel like more of a community, and that I thank you for sharing your stories and for these other stories with all of us as we make our way through this crazy time.
Thank you so much, Susan. And I just can't recommend these 2 books enough, Being Both and the Interfaith Family Journal. One is a book about your experience and experience of others, trying to balance and respect and honor both cultures. And the other one is a workbook, which I've been really enjoying using in my home as well. And I plan to give as a gift.
Thank you. Well, hold up Parenting with an Accent while you're at it there.
Parenting with an Accent. It's also available in audio and ebook for anybody interested.
Thank you so much, Masha and Susan. Thank you for sharing your conversation with us this evening. And just a reminder to get your copy of Parenting with an Accent or any of Susan's books, please check with your local independent bookstore or check your local library. Before we close out for tonight, just a reminder, visit us at bpl.org or your local branch for upcoming programs for people of all ages. Here on the screen are a couple of author talks that we have coming up here from the Central Library. Both of them will be held virtually. The first one, Ted Reinstein, will be here in person as well. So information about how to join these programs and many others can be found at bpl.org. We hope to see you very soon at another event like this or at your local library branch. Thank you and good night.